I move Notice of Motion 87 in my name. Mr President, this is a motion to establish a joint select committee of 7 members drawn across the Assembly and the Council to report on the increase in the Victorian road toll in 2019 and in particular to look at a number of individual elements which are listed in the motion. The first is the current Victorian road safety strategy 2016 to 2020 and progress towards the targets which are set down in that road safety strategy, which are a 20% reduction in fatalities with less than 200 fatalities annually by 2020. The adequacy and scope of the current driver drug and alcohol testing regime, the adequacy of current speed enforcement measures, the adequacy of current response to smartphone use, including the use of technology to reduce the impact of smartphone use on driver distraction, measures to improve the affordability of newer vehicles incorporating driver assist technologies, the adequacy of current road standards and road asset maintenance regime, the adequacy of driver training programs and related funding structures, including the L2P program, and the adequacy and accuracy of road collision data collection. Mr President, we've seen over the course of 2019 an increase in Victoria's road toll, and as of the 3rd of June the road toll stood at 141, which has been recognised as a substantial increase on the same time last year. And that understandably has given rise to concerns in the Victorian community as to the causes of that increase in the road toll compared to the same period last year. And of course, for 2018, Victoria recorded its lowest road toll with 213 fatalities. And it's worth putting that figure in context, Mr President, because the road toll is something which has been a focus in Victoria over 50 years. And it was back in 1970 that Victoria recorded its highest road toll, which was 1,061 fatalities. And prior to 1970 there had been an increase in the number of fatalities on Victorian roads as the adoption of and ownership of private motor vehicles had increased in the post-war period. We saw the number of fatalities on Victorian roads increase. And indeed, the Australian peak also occurred in 1970. But from a Victorian peak of 1,061 in 1970, we've seen a downward trend. And it's fair to say that in the 50-year period, 49-year period since 1970, there have been years when the road toll has gone up, and there's been years where the road toll has gone down, almost an equal number. Half the years it's increased, half the years it's fallen, but the trend has been down. Down from 1,061 to 213 last year. So the trend has certainly been in the right direction and obviously has occurred in a time when vehicle use in Victoria has increased dramatically as the population has increased, as the ownership of private motor vehicles has increased. And it's fair to say that in the international context, Victoria's road toll and Australia's road toll is low. Internationally, and on an international comparison basis, road toll is typically measured in 3 ways, but the most common way in which it's measured is fatalities as a ratio to 100,000 head of population. And on that measure, in 2018, Victoria recorded about 3.3 fatalities per 100,000 head of population, which puts Victoria well at the top of global rankings, in the top 10, surrounded largely by countries in the Scandinavian region and more generally in Europe. Victoria's performance on that basis, on the 100,000 population basis, is better than the Australian performance, which is also at the top of the league table. Other rankings which are used, fatalities per number of vehicles, or million vehicles, 1,000 vehicles, fatalities per vehicle kilometres. And that, of course, takes into account those jurisdictions which either have a very low number of vehicles or a very low number of vehicle kilometres, distance travelled by vehicles. But on all those three measures, Australia and Victoria are at the top of international rankings, and it's in that context, with that long-term decline in the road toll and Victoria's and Australia's standing internationally in road safety, that this debate should be considered. Last Friday, I attended the Road Safety Forum, which had been convened by the government in response to the spike which had occurred this year in road fatalities. And Mr Barton was there, Dr Q was there, the Minister for Road Safety was unable to attend for family reasons, and I make no criticism of her for that. The member for South West Coast, Mr Britnell, in the other place, was there, and the Minister for Police and Emergency Services was also at the forum. Not surprisingly, Mr President, the issues which were raised in the course of that forum and the levers for road safety which were raised in that forum were not new. They were issues of improved vehicles, issues of improved drivers, and issues of improved roads. Those are the three pillars which underpin the approach to road safety. They were the three pillars which underpinned the approach when I was the Minister for the TAC back in previous government. They continue to be the pillars which underpin a strategy for road safety today, because obviously those are the levers which will make a difference. Improving our drivers, improving our vehicles, improving our roads are the ways to improve road safety outcomes. Now, Mr President, the motion before the House, the motion before the House today seeks to establish a joint committee, and this is on the background of the current government's decision to abolish the long-standing Road Safety Committee in the Victorian Parliament, a committee which had made a tangible contribution to road safety in this state. It was the initiatives of that committee, for example, which led to the introduction of seatbelts in Victoria, which in fact was probably the single largest factor leading to a reduction in the road toll from the 1,061 back in 1970. So that committee had runs on the board, as has been canvassed extensively in here previously. The Coalition did not support the abolition of that Road Safety Committee, and so today, via this mechanism, this proposal for a joint select committee, we are seeking to re-establish a committee focused on road safety, which spans both the Council and the Assembly. Notably, Mr President, in the concluding remarks at the Road Safety Forum last Friday, the Assistant Commissioner for Road Policing, Stephen Lean, in fact remarked that there is a responsibility for the Parliament as a whole, not just the government, to have a role in road safety. And I think it was very much, that was a very strong message in the concluding remarks from the Assistant Commissioner, and very much supports the Coalition's contention that this should be a joint select committee which spans both houses of this Parliament. The government has flagged its intention to amend this motion to, rather than establish a select committee, to instead refer the subject matter of this inquiry to the Economy and Infrastructure Committee. That is not something that the Coalition will support because, firstly, as I said, we believe this is a matter that should be dealt with across both houses, drawing on the resources in terms of the members across both houses. Equally, we believe it should have a singular focus as a committee on road safety. What's proposed by the government in referring this to the Economy and Infrastructure Committee is to limit this inquiry to members of the Council, participation by members of the Council, but equally to add this as simply one more inquiry to an agenda at the Economy and Infrastructure Committee, which is already heavy. The House has just voted earlier this morning to refer Mr Barton's matter in relation to public transport access to that Economy and Infrastructure Committee. That committee is already undertaking an investigation into animal activism. It's undertaking an investigation into the commercial passenger vehicle hire sector. It now has a new referral in relation to public transport access in and around central Melbourne. And with the government's proposal today, the road safety inquiry that I'm proposing would be dropped down as a fourth inquiry on that list of things for EIC to do, most of which it's required to report by the end of the year. So it's our view that tacking this inquiry onto the bottom of that EIC list as just another inquiry doesn't reflect the importance of the road safety issue, doesn't reflect the importance of having involvement across both houses in looking at some of the issues which underpin the changes in road safety in Victoria. So it's our intention to oppose the government's amendment to make this an EIC inquiry, very much in the belief that it should be a standalone committee which spans both houses of Parliament. I'd like to turn now to, in the time remaining, to some of the individual elements that we are seeking to look at through this inquiry. So the overarching issue to look at is the increase in fatalities this year, and I've already put that in the context of the long-term trends and the context of the international environment. The elements we're specifically seeking to look at through this inquiry are firstly the road safety strategy, 2016-2020, and the targets that are contained within that. At the forum last Friday, one of the presenters, I think it was Joe Calafuro, the Chief Executive of the Transport Accident Commission, used the analogy of road safety with family violence. And he made the point that in the family violence sphere, we wouldn't accept 200 fatalities a year or 200 injuries a year, that we seek to eliminate family violence or domestic violence altogether. I'm not sure that analogy is entirely appropriate for the road toll situation, because in addressing domestic violence and addressing family violence, we are recognising that it's not appropriate for any victim of family violence, the men and women who are subject to family violence, who are subject to attacks, who are subject to attempts of control, to be in that environment. It's an environment which is recognised as being wrong, criminally wrong, morally and ethically wrong. In relation to the road toll, we are not looking at an activity which has at its heart criminality or ethical or morally moral corruption. We're looking about an environment where people are undertaking a lawful activity that involves risk, and we have seen fatalities and casualty collisions as a consequence of that risk. So I'm not sure that the analogy of how we treat family violence and how we treat the road toll is necessarily an appropriate analogy, and I think we need to look at the realities that with the road safety and the road toll, there are competing interests. We are looking at, through the road system, through the transport system, we are seeking to move people and goods efficiently and quickly around the state, and we recognise in doing that that compromises are made. It may not be popular to say that, but it's a reflection of the reality. And if we were accepting there are no compromises, then every road in Victoria would be a Class A road, which it clearly is not, and it clearly can't be. Likewise, if your view was to get an absolute outcome on road safety, the easiest way you could achieve that tomorrow would be to drop the speed limit. You could drop the speed limit to 40 on every road across the state, and the effect of that would almost certainly be 0 fatalities. But it's also completely impractical to do so. So inevitably, whether we like it or not, we make decisions between priorities and balancing the need for people to be able to move around the state on our road network with the priorities around road safety. And it is a balancing act, and it is a proposition that requires decisions to be made and priorities to be assigned and relative weights to be assigned to those different factors. So we can get an absolute outcome, but it comes at a significant absolute cost. And we, as policymakers and as a community, recognise there has to be a balance between those considerations and those factors. In putting this motion together, we sought to highlight some of the key issues which are of relevance today in the road safety debate, and in considering that balance between our competing objectives. The second element that I've included is the issue of adequacy and scope of driver drug and alcohol testing. Obviously, the use of drugs and alcohol in driving is illegal for a good reason. The use of drugs, full stop, is illegal. And interestingly, data that came out of the forum last week, highlighted that drug driving has become a significant issue in the Victorian community, perhaps even a greater issue than the use of alcohol on the roads. And of course, the practicalities of the testing regime make its detection, widespread detection, more difficult than it is for alcohol. So we seek to examine that element through this motion. The next element I'm seeking to examine is the adequacy of current speed enforcement measures. This is again goes to the point that I raised before, that we can have an absolute outcome if we decide to drop speed limits dramatically across the state. But that's not a practical outcome. And while it was raised in the course of the forum last week that we could drop the speed limits, it's also a pretty lazy policy response. And we've seen in going around the state in the last couple of years, we've seen some key regional roads, and one that comes to mind is the road from Kilmore to Lancefield, which has been long-term 100k an hour road. It's a road which has had a deteriorating pavement for a period of time, and rather than repair that pavement, the response has been to drop the speed limit from 100 to 80. Likewise, on the road from Kyneton to Bendigo, again, traditional country road, 100km/h zone, but because of the deteriorating pavement, again, rather than fixing it, the default, the lazy option has been to drop the speed limit. So that's a lazy policy response. I note that as part of the government's proposed amendments to this motion, the Minister is seeking to add to that reference around the current enforcement regime, to add a reference to speed management policies. And it's not my intention to oppose the inclusion of those words in the motion, but I say at the outset, we don't see simply dropping speed limits as a solution to the issue, because we need a road network which is quick and efficient for users. There are parts of the world which have lower road tolls than Victoria, better performance in road safety than Victoria, which also have speed limits which are far higher than Victoria. Some of them have unlimited roads. So a response of let's just drop all the default speed limits is not the solution to addressing the road safety challenge that we have in Victoria. The next element the motion picks up is the issue of smartphone use and driver distraction, which occurs, which has become a factor, and technology means to mitigate that. I just want to go back briefly, Mr. President, to the issue of speed. And in this year's budget, the government has allocated funding for a further 96 speed cameras. It is budgeting over the next 4 years to collect around $2 billion in speed camera revenue. And one of the challenges with that as a road safety measure is the risk of cynicism developing and expanding in the community. If the community perceive that those speed cameras are not being used in locations where casualty collisions occur, if they see them being used on straight, good Class A roads, stretches of of freeway and the like, if they see them being used in intersections where collisions, where there is no data record of collisions or injuries, the community becomes cynical. When they see a budget that's under pressure, suddenly relying on $2 billion of speed camera revenue, they become cynical, which undermines the road safety message. It undermines attempts to improve road safety. So we need to be very careful where those sorts of measures are introduced, that they are seen by the community as being appropriate, that they are seen as responding to actual issues on the road and are not seen as simply short-term convenient revenue-raising measures, because if they are seen that way, it will completely undermine the road safety strategy. The next item I'd like to touch on, Acting President, is affordability of newer vehicles with driver assist technologies. Interestingly, again, we've seen over the period that we've focused on the road toll, the 50 years, particularly the last decade, 15 years, 20 years, the introduction of technology in vehicles has had a dramatic impact on road safety. It has had a dramatic impact on the survivability of collisions, casualty collisions, and it's had a dramatic impact on allowing drivers to avoid those collisions in the first instance. This element is particularly around the affordability of those vehicles. And one of the issues which was raised last week at the forum, and again it was Assistant Commissioner Lean who made the comment, he spoke about the decision by Victoria Police to replace its Holden pursuit vehicles with BMW M5 vehicles. And he indicated that the key driver of the government's, or VicPol's, decision to buy BMW M5s to replace the Holden pursuit vehicles was safety considerations. That those vehicles have a high level of safety, number of safety features, and that was the driver of VicPol's decision. The irony of that, Mr. President, is that the government, through its most recent budget, increasing stamp duty on what it regards as luxury vehicles, has in fact made those very same vehicles less affordable for Victorian citizens. So the vehicles that Victoria Police has bought specifically because they've been identified as vehicles with a high safety capability have been made more unaffordable to the general Victorian community by way of this tax increase. So, excuse me, that's why we've included this element around the affordability of vehicles with driver assist technologies. The next element I'll touch on, Mr. President, is the issue of our road standards and the maintenance of roads. As I said at the outset, it's recognised that the keys to road safety aren't new, they haven't changed, they are as they have been for a long time. Better drivers, better roads, better vehicles. On the issue of better roads, this inquiry seeks to look at what we have as road standards in Victoria, the different classes of roads, and whether our roads are in fact maintained to the standard they are designated, and whether we have the ongoing maintenance regime to support that. And that's, as one of the three pillars of road safety, is one of the key aspects that this inquiry is seeking to examine. The other element I'll touch on, Mr. President, is the issue of adequacy and accuracy of road collision data collection. This is an issue which has been raised over a number of years by a number of community organisations and interest groups who are associated with road safety. Their concerns as to the accuracy of the data we have in relation to road collisions, and as to whether they accurately reflect causal factors in road safety. And obviously we talk in causal factors in a relatively narrow band of things related, drug and alcohol, speeding, etc. Vehicle factors, which are obviously relatively small in relation to the road toll. But concerns have been raised as to the accuracy of the data we have and whether it's collected in an independent manner, and whether we can rely on it in genuinely showing causal factors underlying accidents. So that has also been included as a reference in this inquiry. So, Mr President, we believe this is an important inquiry. It covers a set of factors which are deserving of the Parliament's attention at a time when we are looking at an increase in the road toll this year. The Coalition believes it should be done by a joint committee which is dedicated to this task. It should not simply be added on as a fourth inquiry for the Economy and Infrastructure Committee confined to this Parliament. It should be done across both houses. It should be a dedicated task looking at road safety, and on that basis, Mr President, I would urge members of this House to support this motion. It does go to an issue of concern to the Victorian community. We have seen in the past the great value that has been created in this area by a joint road safety committee that spanned the membership of both houses, that brought forward ideas which subsequently became policy and had a dramatic impact on road safety in this state. A new joint committee specifically looking at the events of this year is an important opportunity to continue that legacy, and I would urge the House's support for this motion today.